Welcome to today's session, Creating Innovation in the Business Sector. Some themes we have include leadership, innovation, collaboration, community action, and inspiration. I'd like to first welcome our moderator, Laurel Graefe. Laurel Graefe is the regional executive at the Nashville branch of the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta. As the senior officer leading the Federal Reserve in Nashville, she is responsible for the branch's board of directors and strategic direction. She oversees its economic research activities and advises on monetary policy. Her work gathering and synthesizing insight from Tennessee business executives and community leaders brings Main Street perspectives to national monetary policy deliberations. Laurel represents the Fed in regular speeches about the business environment, the future of the American economy, and risks to the economic outlook. Her work has been published in The Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Market Watch, among others, and featured on National Public Radio. She also co-authored The Handbook of Oil Politics, published by Routledge. Prior to assuming her current position, Laurel served as director of the Nashville branch's Regional Economic Information Network and held a number of positions with the Atlanta office of the Federal Reserve, including as a director overseeing inflation and energy market analysis for the research department. She joined the bank in 2005 as an intern, specializing in international economics. Laurel is deeply engaged in her community, including serving on the boards of the Economics and Finance Department at Tennessee State University, 10 Greenland Conservancy, and Leadership Middle Tennessee. She is also chair of the Atlanta Fed's Diversity Advisory Council. Laurel was named a 2020 Woman of Influence by the Nashville Business Journal and a 2021 Most Powerful Woman by Focus magazine. She is a member of both Leadership Nashville and Leadership Middle Tennessee and was elected as a Tennessee representative to the International Women's Forum. She earned an MBA with honors from Vanderbilt's Owens Graduate School of Management and a bachelor's degree in economics, summa cum laude, from Agnes Scott College. It's an honor to be standing here today as a Scotty myself and introduce this amazing speaker. Let's give her a warm welcome.
Gosh, thank you so much. It is such an honor and a joy to be a part of this conversation and this gathering, and I am just over the moon to be joined by such an absolutely brilliant panel of women leading in really big ways on climate in the business sector. So first, I would like to welcome, and I am starting with just job titles, which I feel like it does this much to actually reflect the work that you're doing. Evelyn Bolden works as a Senior Director of Clean Tech Strategy and Investments with Cox Enterprises. Sarah Chandler is the Managing Director of Equity and Access with Elemental Accelerator. Danielle Decatur is the Director of Data Center Environmental Sustainability with Microsoft. And Ashley Schulten is the Managing Director and Head of Responsible Investing for BlackRock's Global Fixed Income Platform. And I think that the diversity of this group and the varying ways each of you are leading your work and your voice to bring progress on climate is just such a wonderful example of how women-led climate leadership and activism is really about calling in. It's not something that says, climate leadership has to look like X, or you must have this specific set of skills and contribute in this particular way, but instead is a calling in and an invitation that welcomes each of us to show up with our skills, our platforms, our unique perspectives, and our unique abilities to influence change to the imperative work of climate activism. So professional bios are on the conference website and are absolutely incredible. But as is always the case, I think your bios only scratch the very surface of each of your experience and work leading in the climate space. So instead of going through the bios, I'd like to just kick us off by jumping right in and ask each of you to tell us a little about how you got into this work, and how you see your organization and maybe more broadly your sectors addressing this question of climate solutions and climate justice more broadly. And Evelyn, I will start with you, please.
Of course. Thank you for being here. What an amazing opportunity. So I guess I'll start with Cox first, because listen, I work for an amazing company. And if you don't know much about it, please do spend some time to get familiar. But Cox has a 120-year rich history of building leading innovative businesses that leave the world a better place. We have a legacy of environmental stewardship, and have committed to figuring out, how do we operate in a world that is facing, pressing problems like food and energy and waste, and what can we do about it? And we're so committed that we're focused on, building a clean tech business that's focused on resource efficiency by the year 2030. So very aggressive, but we are absolutely excited to do it. And I've had the wonderful opportunity to join this team and do this wonderful work, which is a great reason to get up every morning. So I'm so glad to be here and to share what we're doing at Cox, and to hopefully kind of get you all excited about the challenge before us and what we can do about it.
Awesome. Thank you. Thank you so much, Evelyn. We're so glad you're here with us. Ashley.
Well, again, thank you so much for having us. Mirror Evelyn's thought. This is an amazing group. We've had some really interesting pre-calls, and I've learned a lot more about Agnes College and all the amazing work that's going on there. So I work at BlackRock, and for those of you who are not familiar with BlackRock, BlackRock is a global asset manager. We're one of the biggest, if not the biggest, global asset managers in the world. And as such, I think that we feel a responsibility to make sure that we are doing our part to contribute to this global dialogue. One of the things that we've been, I think, really loading on for the last number of years is this concept that as a global asset manager, we are a fiduciary, right? So we invest money for your 401k, for your local teacher's pension plan, et cetera. And so how do we think about climate risk as investment risk? How do we think about what's happening in terms of natural disasters that are, occurring, potentially weakening our muni portfolio? Losses we're taking there. How do we think about global regulation, whether it's EV standards or carbon taxes? How does that affect our portfolio? And so that idea and trying to be a good fiduciary and recognizing that climate is not just a nice to have thing anymore, it's something that really is endemic to everything that we do. And to be a good investor, we are really stewards of long-term capital. And so what are the data sets we have to use? What are the approaches that we need? How do we be on the cutting edge of this? How do we put a number behind how significant this risk is? And I think the more and more work that we do on this, the more we realize how imperative action is today. So that is sort of the backdrop of what we focus on. My journey here, again, I work in an asset management group. I have spent my career trading fixed income. Much of my career was trading derivatives and options. And so I think I became interested in the science of climate risk a number of years ago because I thought it was mispriced risk. And I didn't think that markets were doing a great job yet into figuring out how to price it. And as options traders, we're always interested in the unknown. And this was one of the unknowns. And so my role really evolved as I learned more and more about climate. I am not a climatologist, although we employ them, and we've hired a number of them recently at BlackRock. My role is to figure out where are these unpriced risks in the market and where are the data sets that we can use to figure them out. I think, the topic of the panel is really interesting, women and climate justice. I think it's particularly interesting from two angles. Number one, that we see that climate change hurts the poor disproportionately. It's pushing more people into poverty. It's exacerbating income inequality, and that really hurts women the most. All the studies show that it's women that have the labor add-ons. It's women that experience mortality, et cetera, in greater numbers because of climate change. The second thing I would say, in my small world in my sector where we work in the ESG ecosystem, having worked in financial markets for a very long time and it being really male dominated, I'm sure many of you feel the same way. One of the interesting things about the ESG space is that we we generally see a high proportion of women in this space. And maybe that's because we started in this earlier as a cohort, but on many panels that I go on ESG, there are a lot of women that are really pushing this agenda, which is different than the derivative panels that I used to go on in years before. So I'd note that we are really making a contribution in this space.
Yeah, I love that, and that has very much been my experience in the space as well. Sara, do you mind sharing next?
I would love to share next. Thank you, Laurel, and thank you for that, Ashley and Evelyn. I'm so excited to be here. I say this all the time, but what a time it is for all of us to be here on this topic with you all. It's really exciting progress, and I'm excited for your questions and for your follow-up and for this conversation to just be the beginning. So really happy to be here. I am with an organization called Elemental Accelerator. It's a nonprofit, and we work with for-profit startups. We're an accelerator of climate startups. So we are a mostly, funny you should say that, Ashley, a mostly women interdisciplinary team of folks who think about how to accelerate and scale climate companies across water and food and ag and circular economy, mobility, and energy. And what I do is I help to think about the lens that a startup CEO and a really early company develops for themselves on equity and justice and access. And we've developed a program that helps companies think about and really grapple with what it looks like to incorporate equitable business practices early. It's truly a privilege to get to think about the cake while it's being built before, things come up and you're trying to add in, eggs to a fully baked cake. That just doesn't work. Trying to do it at the beginning and make sure it's a part of, the fabric of the company and it's woven in. I got to this work in a windy way. I have a background in law and social justice. I went to Howard Law. Before that, I was at Emory, so I'm also Atlanta's a big part of my heart. I miss it. And I, having been at Howard, just had this really strong desire to work on social justice at the intersection of the law. Didn't know how I would do it, but knew that would be part of my career. And it wasn't until I got there that I learned how important policy was and bringing your perspective to the front end of the law. And I got to really go deep on a policy fellowship at the Greenlining Institute as a racial justice nonprofit out here in Oakland. And while there, I was able to think about local, state, and federal policy in a different way than I had ever before, with a focus on equity and justice. And from there, I went to a municipal utility. So I got to think about the intersection of community benefits and environmental justice and the impacts of a potentially polluting entity. And from there, I was recruited to think about and build up policy and community at Elemental Accelerator, and have been able to take a really entrepreneurial approach and build up our program from there. So share all that to say that this is an extremely, interdisciplinary, intersectional sector, and you can see yourself in it no matter where you're focused, if you'd like to. And I think that's a really exciting part of our work and a part of climate work in general. So happy to be here and really happy to speak with this wonderful panel of ladies. Thank you for having me.
Thank you, Sara. Your story brought me back to Seva Gandhi's comments in the earlier panel about different types of systems change, and there can be the dismantling work and the change from within, and there's also the important work of creating new. And one thing I really treasure about this collective of voices we have for our discussion today is there's a lot of intersectionality even across those various different approaches to systems change. And I think your story captures that so well. So thank you for sharing. And Danielle.
Good morning, everyone. It's such a joy to be here with you virtually. I'm grateful to the conference organizers and my fellow panelists for coming together in this virtual platform, although I do wish we were there in person together, because that would just be, I look forward to the day when we can resume such things. My name is Danielle Decatur, and I'm part of Microsoft's business group that is responsible for designing, building, and operating our data centers. And our data centers represent the largest physical footprint for our company at this time. Our company has some aggressive sustainability goals, carbon negative by 2030, also water positive, zero waste, and by 2025, protecting more land than we use. And we started this I personally started my journey in sustainability and environmental justice back in 2005 when I was working down in New Orleans and Baton Rouge, addressing Hurricane Katrina efforts there. And since then, I've had an opportunity to pretty much navigate rather slowly toward my dream job. And I would say this is my dream job right now. We started looking at incorporating environmental justice into our sustainability programs a couple of years ago. And we started with our renewable energy procurement, because that is a really massive part of our procurement when it comes to sustainability. So we have two publicly announced power purchase agreements, one with Sol Systems, the developer, and one with Volt Energy. And those structures help provide community funds, and we're directing those funds toward environmental justice projects in under-resourced communities. And our effort here is really to, because we believe that corporate purchasing of renewable energy is really a big part of driving clean energy transition. So the work we're doing in environmental justice is to help try to make that a just transition through our corporate procurement where we can, and make a measurable positive impact for under-resourced communities. So thanks for having me here today.
Thank you. Thank you, Danielle. Well, I will kick off the discussion, but encourage this to be interactive, and we'll plan to open up to audience questions sooner rather than later. But maybe just to kick this off, and this again goes back to part of the discussion that took place in the earlier panel. And I think something that often comes to mind when the public hears about the corporations' participation in ESG and kind of other social responsibility is, it can be really difficult as a member of the public from the outside to really distinguish between whether a corporation is making a commitment from a sort of PR or a marketing angle, or doing something that really shows up as what feels like a genuine commitment to change. And I think importantly, an ability to actually drive that change. So it's not just the commitment, but actually has done the work to understand really what that means, and a willingness to learn along the way. So I think maybe just one question to throw out there, how does the public tell the difference? And how can we distinguish those things, and how can we kind of hold businesses accountable? And I'll start with Ashley, but encourage anyone to jump in there.
Yes, so we spend a lot of time on this because I would definitely agree that some is marketing and some is actual action. And so we have, lots of teams that go through companies and understand the companies in a very granular way to try to, flesh out what is a nice, pretty report with daisies and bunnies on it, some, anecdotal stories versus, where is the company really investing? What kind of R&D spend do they have? Where is their revenue coming? And I think there's a whole ecosystem of either data providers that are starting to try to scale this to provide, at least for investors, some real granularity on that. So I would say there are people that are actually trying to go under the hood. I would argue, though, that while it may appear that we have this movement going on where we call some of it greenwashing or misrepresenting, I do think that there is a a cycle on this. And so I do think that sometimes companies are not quite sure how to figure out what their sustainability plans are. They're eager to join this conversation, and that some kinds of announcements or marketing efforts can then over time actually turn itself in to positive action within the company. So I do think some of the announcements that we're seeing from companies, whether they're making net zero pledges, things like that, the announcement is done, and then the conversation, okay, let's figure out how we get there later. And so I'm actually okay with it. I don't like it when I see outright cheating, and we certainly are there to call companies out on this, but when companies are making pledges of the things that they're going to do in the future, we want to stay with them and support them in that, because we're all on transition. There has to be massive changes that happen in society and the economy for us to get to 2 degrees. And so I think we want to give credence that's a work in progress.
So I will add to that, Ashley, that is absolutely consistent. On your side of the house, you're actually looking for companies and what they're doing. We try to make sure that, Laurel, to your question, that we're walking the walk. I mean, like Microsoft, we have some very aggressive environmental goals on, zero waste to landfill by 2024. And we've actually accelerated our water and carbon neutral goals by 10 years because we want to do as much as we can, as fast as we can, because we truly believe that we can make an impact. But we started our formal sort of internal Cox Conserves initiative in 2007, which is really about greening our own internal operations. But truthfully, that work began decades before. So, hopefully, we are sort of manifesting, what we're talking about, and sort of getting rid of the stigma that this is just PR and it's just marketing, and we're actually sort of doing the work that is necessary to create a better world.
I might chime in on this as well. So first, with respect to our climate commitments, sustainability commitments, we've made a commitment to publish progress reports. So, and I think we've been pretty forthright about acknowledging the challenges that we face in really undertaking these targets and publishing our learnings along the way via our annual sustainability report. We have a biannual blog post update that comes out from our Chief Sustainability Officer. And then we also have various white papers. We have on our website, we have Microsoft.com, Wax Sustainability, and it's got a series of white papers on that. Written a couple on our achieving zero waste, and then also on reducing embodied carbon in our construction. So we really want to try to be transparent about our process, so that it gives stakeholders, shareholders, the public, confidence that we're really trying to do the work, and then also try to help others in the industry. With respect to our environmental justice program, the foundation of that program is a collaboration with external environmental justice advisors, folks that have been in the space for decades in activism and in energy democracy movements. And that's really, I think in your question, Laurel, you call that willingness to learn. So that has been really the foundation of the program, is to acknowledge that we don't know what communities want or need, or even the impacts that they have felt truly. So we really rely on those advisors to inform our strategy and help us self-examine. And just overall, I think the more companies that take on these sustainability goals, by taking on those goals, you're committing to transparency and traceability. And when you endeavor in that direction, then you can really understand your true impact in a very intimate way. So I think the more companies that take on these targets, the better, and the more we can share with each other about what we're learning, the better too.
Yeah, I'd love to build on what you touched on, Danielle, because it seems like such a critical part of this work, and one that isn't always getting the most attention in public spaces, and it's around kind of centering justice and equity in our pursuit of climate goals. And so I'll ask Sara to start just sharing a bit, I think, especially with your background in the social justice space and now helping to be a catalyst for some change and leadership as we look, I mean, very much in a kind of for-profit enterprise space. How do we connect those two and be sure that we are not pursuing one at the expense of the other?
I really appreciate the question. I think it's so interesting because we have, the similar dynamic on the equity and justice side. As Ashley was mentioning, greenwashing, we have equity washing, and we often laugh about how ambitious it is to pair, both of these existential crises together and say, like, we got it on our backs, we can do this. But they're so inextricably tied. And once you start to think about them together, it all starts to make sense and become a lot more clear, the roots of it. And so I think for us, we try to think about it in two ways. First, kind of at the individual, leadership level, your, bold ambition as a person, your passion for the topic, and the lens you bring to your work is so important. And we need leaders who can say the hard thing. A lot of climate justice work is very awkward conversations, to put it lightly, saying what's not being said, and sharing awareness in that way really requires community as well. That's the second way we think of it. So solving in cohorts and in partnership with other leaders and other organizations that have the same goal, even if you might go about it in different ways, because everyone has different skills. This is a movement and we all have different strengths that we can bring to this work. And so for us, we have really tried to zero in on frameworks that help us think about and talk about equity. And one of them is equity in, equity out. And so we kind of help our companies think about the ways that their internal practices can create a better work environment, better business outcomes, and how inextricably tied that is to their impact out in the world. So you can't go out and say you're going to have impact on community and with community and then not have any representative team members or practices that make people feel included. That's only going to show out in your external facing work. So kind of thinking of both as a yin and yang and talking about it that way. And then we also think about how we act and how our behavior has gotten us to this place. And so how we have to think about equitable behavior. So we also encourage our startup founders to think about principles of equitable behavior. We have 6 of them. We call them, there's a mnemonic for them, ACT UP, which are kind of agency, collaboration, clear and comprehensive processes for equity, transparency, understanding history and context, and humble posture. And we try to bring those principles to our work as kind of a flexible way to think about and build in equity in your work and out in the places that you work. Because if we're going to try to really think intentionally and act out in communities, especially in low-income frontline communities that are facing compounding impacts of racial inequity, systemic inequity, environmental degradation, lack of infrastructure, we have to change the way that we act. And we have to acknowledge that what we have been doing hasn't worked. And so we do on the ground clean infrastructure projects. And so we really have to carry forward those principles and try to interrupt the other behavior before we go in, because it will get in our way every time and make it hard for us to have successful projects and create the benefits that clean technology can create. So I'll stop there, but we try to think a lot about and really deeply about kind of the introspective work that it takes to go out and do really positive work in the world too.
Maybe I'll jump in on this. So, getting to your question, I would argue that this is a false choice. I think there is a narrative brewing that you have to choose between social or environmental. And I would argue that the choice is social and environmental, or yesterday's way of doing business. And I couch that in these concepts that I laid out earlier, is that long-term climate risk is a social issue, hurting the poor disproportionately. But also, even I think in today's society, we see that there are lots of good jobs in, for example, the renewable sector in the US. I think actually in the US, we actually employ more people in the renewable sector than we do in the old fossil sector. And so these are good jobs. These are new jobs. They can be funded by infrastructure bills. I also think that that these are jobs that we cannot export. So these are durable. I do think there are adjustment periods for people to retrain. I think that is happening because of technology and globalization anyways. But we see these two things connected as one. Now, certainly there are projects that, there are debate, like nuclear, for example. It's a big debate in our market. Nuclear has tremendous climate goals at the risk of big social risks. So there are things where, where we can get specific on a large hydro, for example, displaced communities. You want to make sure that if you're investing in green projects, that you want to make sure there are social safeguards in place. But I don't necessarily think it has to be framed as an or choice versus how can we make these two things work together.
I will add to that as well. So in addition to our financial goals and what we believe to be the intersection of business and environmental, we also have expanded our thinking around corporate social responsibility and have developed some really aggressive goals on how do we align our social responsibility with our financial goals as well as our environmental goals. And so I already reached out to Sara because we're talking about social equity as well as environmental equity. And some other key pillars that will help us think about broader investment themes and how we bring that to life and as a part of our overall commitment to leaving the world a better place. I don't think you can do one without the other. So Ashley, I second those thoughts as well.
If I may, I'd like to third those thoughts. And also, Sara, I've actually been taking notes on everything y'all have been saying because I'm learning so much from this panel myself. Thank you. Sara, some of your comments about integration internally, looking introspectively, and having culture change from the inside while directing these outward benefits to communities, I think is spot on. I see our environmental justice work going hand in hand with our internal diversity and inclusion efforts and our commitments we've made around that, as well as our commitments to supplier diversity. And our recent power purchase agreement with Volt Energy, a big focus of that, the direction of, so the way that the agreement is structured is that a portion of project revenues from the solar installations will go toward a community fund. And some of that fund will go toward community level, community driven projects, like rooftop solar or resilience projects, but also a portion of those community funds will go toward building diversity in the renewable energy sector. So to Ashley's point about, this is a whole new, it's not new anymore with renewables, but it's really still emerging. And so it's an opportunity to build an inclusive economy. And so the focus of that agreement with Volt and Gilbert Campbell, the CEO there, is to focus across job classifications. So a lot of workforce development programs, there are great workforce development programs out there now. Some of them are more focused on the temporary construction jobs, installation jobs. And so we'd certainly like to focus there, but also focus on the across the job classifications. So the managers, leaders, owners in the sector, perhaps targeting adjacent industries like M&A or legal or finance and cross-training and encouraging folks to get into the renewable sector so that companies like Microsoft have diverse owned developers to choose from and to help to partner with.
Danielle, it's so interesting. I went to I've been to some energy conferences recently, and I felt like I was back at a bond trading conference in the early 90s in terms of the diversity. So that's really encouraging that you guys are supporting that.
Thanks for mentioning that, Ashley. 100% agree.
So this has been so energizing to me, it's really illuminating all of the work that is happening within business. And I do want to take a little time to explore, sort of by definition, this panel is talking about sort of what climate leadership can look like in the business space, which also means a space that is sort of by definition motivated by profit. And I know there are times that kind of that climate goals and social justice goals may not align with near-term profit goals. And so I think part of it is, I know the national discussion around climate often can talk about leaning on the business sector to lead in certain ways. And so I'm curious, from your perspectives, what are the spaces that really make sense for kind of private enterprise to lead, and where do we draw the line where, from a policy perspective, a regulatory perspective, some other kind of social or organizing body really needs to kind of, we need to rely on someone else to help play a role to align incentives, to be sure that we have an environment set up so that businesses are able to and are kind of set up with the right incentives to make choices that are also aligned with climate goals. So I'll start with you, Ashley, but I love how organic the discussion has been. So please, anyone, feel free to jump in.
Yeah, so I think two thoughts on that. I think the first is that's 100% true that there is tension there between profit goals and sustainability goals. I don't think, I think you can make the case on a long-term basis that these things play out over time. The reality is that a lot of companies are measured on quarterly returns. And so how do we square that? How do we, even as investors, one of the things that we talk about a lot is being a long-term investment, patient capital, giving companies the opportunity to invest in these things, knowing that they're going to play out over the long term. And so really hammering on that theme, working with our clients around that. I think that, it's been said, if this was a profit maker, everybody would be doing it anyways, right? And so where do we find that tension? And I think one of the things that I find interesting to work on is this idea that we can reward companies for some of this activity that they planned by offering investment products that upweight them, right? And so what I mean specifically by this is for us to say, for a company, if you set these goals, we might have more exposure to you in some of these funds. Perhaps that leaks into changing their cost of capital, gives them some financial incentive to do so, gives them better access to funding, et cetera. And so at BlackRock, we've been launching a number of ESG tilted funds that we think that our clients are interested in participating in. I would also argue that over time, financial products are no different than any other product. So if you are going to the store and you like organic milk, some people like it because they think it's healthier. Some people will buy it because they think it's better for, the earth. Some people are willing to pay more for it. That consumer demand exists in all sectors. It exists in my sector, in financial markets and the products we offer, but also in the companies that we invest in. And so getting back to your first point about your second point, how do we highlight the BS from the real action? To the extent that we can have really good reporting on these things and we can highlight this, we can highlight the companies that are really doing this, perhaps then maybe consumers buy their products more. You see the emergence of B Corps and things like that. So that's the one point. The second point I would say is that there has been a push to the private sector to solve some of these climate goals. And I think that we cannot do this alone. I think that some of the reason there's been emphasis on the private sector has just been that globally governments have failed us on this. We have not been able to solve this through public policy Paris was a very big deal and very encouraging. At the same time, I think we're still disappointed in the lack of action that we're seeing globally from governments around this space. So it really has to be in coordination with the private sector doing their thing, and public bodies stop arguing about it and taking some bold action. And so COP26 is coming up right around the corner. I'm really excited for any kind of momentum we see. China just announced the other day that they're going to no longer build coal-fired power plants outside of China. Just little things like that and support from, none of this is really going to happen. We're not going to get to 2 degrees for Paris without government intervention. And so that's a really big part of it that we continue to press on.
I'll add too, we love working with entrepreneurs because they are, they reveal a lot about our just social fabric. So they work at the community level. They have access to a lot of real information about what it takes to work in a community. And you get so much knowledge from kind of the nitty gritty of what it looks like to transition us when it comes to jobs and economic benefits and the training needed, the time needed, and then the local policy needed. And then when you zoom out, they also run into regulatory and policy barriers. And so you get to see from their perspective what it looks like and what it actually takes to get these technologies off the ground. And so we find them to just be very revealing animals, or parts of our work. And so when we think about it, from the local perspective, we know that startups are just one piece of it, and companies are just one piece, and it requires that they understand that they're being leveraged. You're leveraging this business and this technology for something larger than you. From the perspective of on the community level, we think that the place for the company and the startup is to follow the needs of local urgent environmental issues and community leadership. And so we try to hold them accountable to that and invest in companies based on milestone payments where their funding is actually tied to their ability to do these things successfully. And we see it happen, for companies that are smaller and early, that there's kind of a sweet spot where they have these ambitious policy goals, right? They're trying to help California reach its 100% RPS standard. And we work with one company called Ohm Connect that has this really cool, gamified way of trying to even out the energy grid in California. And a lot of their customers were in the Bay Area, tech, part of the tech bubble, where people are able to save money by not using energy at different times of the day. And they realized, we're not going to be able to even meet our goals in the short term if we don't get out of the Bay. We need to meet people in the Central Valley. And that is a very clear business case for them in the next 6 months, that they need to reach folks in frontline communities. And they know that they can't do that if they don't come authentically and in a real way. People aren't going to listen. No one's going to know what you're talking about. And so they have to offer and think about jobs and economic benefits and training. And that was the approach they took, is how do we hire locally in these places and provide real good jobs? And I think that's a really interesting sweet spot for us as a country to think about that leverage point that these startups have, and the types of jobs that they can create in these early stages, and what that looks like for when they grow, how they start to do that early and think about that early and influence policy early by thinking about and acting on their job creation, and then their ability to demonstrate how you can reach these goals. So I think it's an interesting sweet spot for these early stage companies too.
Evelyn, I think I saw you go off of mute a couple of minutes ago. Did you have anything you wanted to add about this kind of intersection or where you see this connection?
Just something briefly, a couple of things. Ashley, something you said, and then Sarah, something you said caught my attention. First is sort of the tension in terms of short-term financial metrics that you sort of have to meet. And understanding that we want to own and operate long-term growth businesses, and that's where we think, the benefit will be had for a lot of these new technologies. But Sarah, you said, when startups lean into what the social need is, often what we've found is when you solve a real problem, the economics tend to show up. And so we truly believe that. And, unfortunately, we're not a nonprofit, and we do have to show financial gains, and we look very closely and we're very strategic about the opportunities we pursue. But with a company like Bright Farms, for example, that's using a scalable, sustainable technology to produce leafy greens closer to the communities they serve. And, it's organic, it's grown in a greenhouse, and it can come at a premium because people understand the need, and it's healthier, and it reduces the amount of water you use, the amount of land you use. And it's just a really good combination of economics as well as sort of generating good food for people where they live. So I think when you combine those two, you really can get to a place where short-term economics tend to bear out.
Thanks, Evelyn. I'll have Danielle.
Oh, here I am.
Add something. Okay. I've become real jumpy about noticing who goes off mute. Well,
Laurel, you're a fantastic moderator. I appreciate it so much. I do have a couple of points to add, but I also am happy to move on.
I'd love to hear what you have to add.
Okay. So in terms of profitability, for Microsoft, part of a driver for our sustainability efforts is that institutional investors and customers are asking for this. And so that definitely creates an imperative from that perspective. I'm also fortunate to be working in the tech sector where my colleagues at our competitor companies, I really do think of them as colleagues, because every time they push the envelope, then I have that creates more, it enriches my business case to push the envelope. So super grateful to them. And then regarding the intersection of private sector and government, yes, we need the regulatory environment to support the clean energy and regenerative economy transition, from closure of fossil fuel and industrial facilities and more responsible operations to community solar opportunities, making community solar accessible to folks, and particularly low-income folks. And then regarding back to referring to what Sarah was saying about local hiring provisions, like we really do feel that our supply chain is a great leverage point to drive change. Large companies tend to contract with large companies. But if large companies can create opportunities to engage smaller, diverse-owned businesses, social enterprises in their supply chain to really invigorate those areas of the economy, I think that would be a really beneficial path forward.
Thank you, Danielle. I'm glad you shared.
I want to circle back on something I think that Evelyn said that prompted a thought about this concept is sustainability becoming a luxury item? Right. So I think in years past, to be green, it was sort of not so much in vogue, right? It was, the Birkenstocks, and you had your Prius, and that wasn't necessarily, I think, what the retail investor was paying up for. And I think it's an interesting question to think about how society is changing, and is sustainably now a Tesla is sort of like an aspirational item. And can we pivot this view of the sustainable item, even if it costs a little bit more, is now a luxury item, right? And we're willing to pay for that. And I think that's a really interesting concept in branding. I do know there are a number of really high-end fashion companies that have sort of taken this angle and said, we know that it costs more. We're doing it in a sustainable way where we think our client is willing to accept this pass-on cost. And so it's just an interesting pivot to think about that in the context of your question about, profitability.
Yeah, I absolutely love that. And And then the next step further is once we make these things profitable and can do them at a certain scale, do they end up becoming available to everyone in a more cost effective and just kind of broadly accessible way? I mean, as I remember being introduced to a lot of these things for the first time and feeling like, okay, these are extraordinarily out of reach luxury, whether it's sustainable clothes or even organic food, for my family growing up felt like really a stretch. And the growing demand for that kind of thing has really changed the economics and encouraged kind of an investment that helps bring these sorts of things to the public in a different way.
Yeah, I think about batteries in cars. I mean, the more they make, the cheaper they get. So there's sort of almost this Moore's law, concept in technology there.
Yeah. Well, I was totally dishonest at the kickoff. I said we would open up to questions quickly and then got too excited about the conversation that we just kept rolling. But before the next question, I would love to be an audience question, but first would love to just hear from each of you as we think about the people who are joining us today. So, the informed public, students, thinkers, activists, young people, future leaders, what is your kind of one word of wisdom or call to action for them as they think about kind of many of them beginning their careers in the future and wanting to make a difference and also needing to sustain themselves? Evelyn, let's start with you.
Happy to start. And I'm going to borrow some terminology that Ashley used earlier, which is a false choice. I think, and we want to avoid that. I think that if for especially students and folks looking for careers in sustainability and business, you don't have to choose one or the other. I think anymore as we move forward, especially what I'm seeing in my work, that these things absolutely come together and you can do both. And you're going to have to do both because environmental challenge is a pressing issue that we have to solve collectively. I don't think one organization does it alone. So in fact, before I wrap up, I'll be reaching out to all of you ladies because I think that we can figure out, we can learn from each other. And I think we ought to be looking at ways to do that going forward.
So I'll go next. So two things. I get called a lot by young people that are entering the financial markets saying, I want to come work in ESG. I'm really passionate about this. I want to change my job in business. And my advice is always, ESG your own job. We don't need it to be a niche topic. We need every single sector of economy working on how to do this within their sector. So if you're interested in a certain sector or a certain business, find out a way to green that sector. And then I would just encourage to not change once you leave your phase of being. We are changing this world because of what young people are doing. I think even as employers, one of the things that we notice is that there seems to be some of the move from businesses towards sustainability because what they're hearing from young people and the hiring and wanting to be a sustainable company so that they can get the best talent. So keep your standards high, demand this of your employers, demand this of your suppliers, your products, et cetera. And because we are counting on the young generation to continue to push us.
Yeah, I was going to say, I need to be asking y'all for advice. I'm just so inspired by the students and the young people that I've met and the natural intersectional and interdisciplinary ways that I've seen young people look at their careers. And I'm just in awe of that legibility that I'm seeing, that you all are able to think about your identities and really grapple with climate and equity as parts of our current society and where we want to go. And so I feel really inspired by that. And I would say, please continue to do what you all are doing naturally in thinking about how we can solve climate change. I think it is the way that that we've talked about it at Elemental is equity in, equity out. It's the inside strategy and the outside strategy, as Ashley was mentioning. Bring your lens to anything that you do. You can work on marketing and bring it to a sales team. You can think about data and computers and engineering and bring an equity lens to that. It's possible, and you all are showing us how to do it. So I'm just really excited and awe, and would love to be a resource to folks. And we have lots of career pathways programs at Elemental that would encourage folks to check out.
I think for me, I want to echo what my colleagues here have said. I think I'm on the sustainability team, but in order to get sustainability things done, I have to work with folks in the construction team, the operations team, the supply chain team. So all those folks are also working on sustainability, even though it might not be in their job title. And so I think defining who you want to be in this world, not tied to a job role, how you want to show up, what you want to get done, what's your vision, and then that will come through in whatever job you're doing. And also to those folks that are working, on the edge, whether it be in sustainability or citizenship or whatever your field is, if the work feels hard, that's the work that needs to be done. So, and I think because it's hard, might be because why it hasn't been done before. So invest in your own resilience, and whatever that looks like for you. Self-care, you're building your network of folks, and because we need you to stay in it. Persistence in the face of setbacks, growth mindset. That's what I would say.
Gosh, I have chill bumps everywhere. Thank you all for sharing. Let's open it up to audience questions. We just have a few more minutes. Before the panel wraps up, then maybe I get the privilege of asking our very last questions. And I want to go back to something that you mentioned at the outset, Ashley, about women's leadership in this space. And we've talked about young people's leadership, but would love to hear a little bit more about kind of how each of you are thinking about kind of centering women. We've heard, there certainly has been a great deal of research around how women are especially vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. And we've seen a lot of kind of women leadership in the activism space. And it really is striking how even within organizations, even this idea of system change from within, we continue to seem to have a lot of women's leadership in that space. So would love to hear if any of you have a perspective about how to continue to elevate that work. Ashley, I see you.
Well, I think what comes into my mind is that I think there's been a decent amount of research on this idea that women in the workplace sometimes do some of what we say the unpaid work, right? And so pick up some of the things for the team that may not be day one profit. And it's really interesting to think about that and some of the roles that women have historically taken up in the workplace in relation to our conversation around how do we make this price in markets and work as a business in general. And so I think what you're seeing as an evolution of this story of sustainability as maybe being viewed previously as unpaid work or add-on are not necessarily that important to the bottom line. And I think there's a total pivot of that going on right now, where I think C-suites are recognizing, oh, this actually does make a difference to our bottom. It makes a difference to our funding. It makes a difference to our clients. And so it's an interesting parallel from the micro to the macro there.
Laurel, can you hear Susan now? Yes.
We can. Yay.
I think
hello, Susan.
We're really going to have to wrap up in the next couple of minutes, as you said. Amy, could you read out the one question that we have from virtual, and let's see if we can get a couple of people to answer it quickly, and then I'm going to help you wrap up. So sorry for the gap there.
I think we have several that are related, that
Okay.
are really thinking about the fact that, so Brittany wrote that in the liberal arts space, students often think that in order to do good in the world, they have to work in the nonprofit sector, the government sector, and stay away from the private sector. And then another question was, what are you all doing to recruit diverse young talent among climate activists who might not think of the private sector first when they're planning their careers?
So why don't we, in the interest of time, let's focus on that last part of that question about recruitment and see if we can get a couple of fast answers. Sorry to make this a speed round.
I can start us off. We have a program at Elemental that we're investing in called Empowering Diversity in Climate Tech, where we are working to recruit students to our companies for summer internship programs and fellowships. And we do that by offering cohort style support during the internship to help folks navigate these new environments. And we offer executive coaching in that opportunity as well. So we think the solution is to bring folks together in cohorts so that they know they've got a community of others who are interested and excited as well, and can help navigate some of the parts of startup culture that might be new or different. We really want to increase representation as well across our CEOs so that folks know that we're here and that you're represented. And if you can't see it, you can't believe it. So we want to make sure that folks know that there are BIPOC folks and leaders who are thinking about climate as well. They can work for and with.
And can I get a, oh, go ahead. One more answer.
Any other quick thoughts about hiring?
I'll just throw in something really quickly here.
I'll call on Danielle to give us a quick recruitment answer.
Oh, I think
I'd like to cede my spot to Evelyn because she was off mute, and I just don't know if you noticed that, Susan.
Right.
That's okay. Yeah, please go ahead, Evelyn.
Thank you.
Thank you. I'll just throw in here really quickly. We're always looking for amazing talent. And I forget who the other panelist who said that the young folks are changing the world and changing requirements about where they want to work and how they want to show up. I think, Danielle, you offered that. We're always asked, what are we doing for the environment? And folks are very selective. Young people are very selective about where they want to work. We pride ourselves on being committed to the environment, and we use that as a recruiting mechanism. So if you're interested in Cox, I would encourage you to take a look at it. We would love to have really smart, amazing people who care about the world as much as we do.
Great. And Laurel, in one last wrap up thing, I want to be sure, I've tried to ask all the moderators to take a minute and just give us their last minute of reflection, because you've been managing this conversation. But what last word would you like to have as well?
I think to distill, I mean, just such incredible nuggets of brilliance. And what I love is they're coming from folks in incredibly different roles with entirely different backgrounds, kind of all working on this same work, but in very different ways. And Danielle, I think your words were so succinct and clear about this is all about deciding kind of what you care about and who you are and showing up in that way. And it can be just as powerful and just as impactful doing it working in construction as working for a nonprofit, so it is not. I would say this is more truly going back to the very beginning of this calling in of this is welcoming expertise and ideas and a collaboration across individuals, across industries, across organizations, not just even in, but I would say especially in places where we historically haven't seen leadership in the past. So it can be frustrating, it can be challenging work, but also such important work to be asking the awkward questions and willing to have the awkward conversations, as Sara mentioned, because a lot of the work is actually not the glamour part you see on TV. It is sometimes being the voice in the room who is willing to raise your hand and slow things down and get a little awkward. So thank you.
Oh, wonderful. Wonderful. Thank you for that. The final words. I'm a threader together person, and it's so hard. I can't thread together what we've heard this morning because we have to move on to our lunchtime keynote. So I'm going to have to just quickly thank this amazing panel. I feel so lucky because I've met them all through this process, and we were having big smiles behind our masks in the audience that connections have already been made among them, and that's so exciting as well. So thank you all for your time preparing and being here, and thanks Laurel Graefe, our alum, for being the manager, including with some tech difficulties this morning. So thank you all for your resilience.